I'd like to start by welcoming everybody to today's webinar. My name is Brian Steiner. I'm NAIFA's Vice President of Business Development. And today's session is brought to you by NAIFA's Business Development Center and our partners at Fairway Independent Mortgage. Today, Jamie Hopkins and Harlan Accola are going to share with you some information on how to talk to your clients about home equity and the reverse mortgage marketplace in your clients' financial planning. Before we get started, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. First, to let you know that all attendees are on mute in listen-only mode. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will address as many questions as time permits at the end of today's session, and it will be recorded and posted on demand later. Now, just a little bit of information regarding our speakers. It's great to have Harlan Accola, National Reverse Mortgage Director at Fairway Independent Mortgage. Harlan has been in the mortgage industry for over 20 years and has worked with all types of loans. His specialty and favorite has always been working amongst the 62 plus age group with over 1,000 reverse mortgages in which he's assisted and finds most rewarding part of his career. And I think he shared earlier that a number of family members actually call him Mr. Reverse in his family. So we're excited to have Harlan participating, and no stranger to NAIFA as well. Jamie Hopkins, Director of Retirement Research at Carson Wealth, and also the Managing Director of Carson Coaching and a financial professor at the University of Creighton. He's a former professor of taxation at the American College and has helped create a number of educational programs, including the Retirement Income Certified Professional, also known as RICP. So we're very, very excited to have these two gentlemen joining us and sharing their knowledge today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the experts and let them get started. Again, please use the Q&A feature for questions, and we'll tackle those at the end of today's session. But ladies and gentlemen, Harlan and Jamie.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the intro from you, Brian. And I'm going to do as little talking as possible because we're very fortunate to have Jamie Hopkins. Obviously, you've already heard his introduction, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I think the most important thing to be aware of is that Jamie has really changed the thought process. Of course, he was one of the top 40 financial services professionals under 40. And the thing that I have always been impressed with for as long as I've known Jamie is he makes sure that he changes the thinking of whoever he's working with. And it was very interesting to me when I saw one of his first articles in Investment News in regard to reverse mortgages, that financial advisors should avoid error by omission and consider reverse mortgages. That's really the topic of a lot of things that we're going to go over today. And I read a book a while back called Don't Believe Everything You Think. Jamie probably could have written that book. He doesn't believe just everything that somebody says. He asks, just a minute, what about this? What about that? And that's the thing that we need, because we are facing challenges as financial advisors and in the mortgage industry that we have never faced before. It's, we hear every day about unprecedented and the new normal and all those things. We need the kind of information that Jamie offers and the thought process that he goes through. Our partnership with NAIFA is highlighted by the things that Jamie is specifically talking about. The thing I'm most concerned about is that financial advisors and people in our industry, mortgage loan officers, reverse mortgage planners, do not talk to each other enough. That would be malpractice in the medical profession, but it's kind of normal in the financial planning world. And we have $7.2 trillion worth of wealth that Jamie talks about that isn't even discussed in most meetings with clients. And many people are concerned about the compliance issue, which are some of the things that Jamie's going to be specifically talking about. If you want more information on the basics of how we work together at Fairway with both forward and reverse mortgages, you will get an email for an invite to another webinar on Friday that I will be doing specifically on how these things work together that we're not going to be covering in the webinar today. So that's Friday at noon Central. You'll get more information on that. One of the things that Jamie is not even aware of is that in about a month, Fairway is going to unveil some financial planning software that works together with financial advisors. That is the first of its kind in the industry that Fairway has spent a lot of time developing, that will show the value of many of the things that Jamie and Dr. Pfau and others have worked together on. If most of you know that Jamie has written the book Rewirement. If you have not read it, you should. And we have some of Dr. Pfau's books, Jamie's books, and the book that I wrote. If you connect with one of our reverse mortgage planners at Fairway, we will make sure that we get one of these books into your hands for free, just for having coffee with us, just for visiting. So the important thing to understand without question is that Jamie has a completely different view than what you may be used to, and you are fortunate to be listening to him on this call. And at that point, I'm going to turn things over to Jamie because there's some wisdom that we need to cover a lot in the next hour.
Unmute myself, and it looks like I'm unmuted now, so there we go. Screen up too, Harlan, thumbs up on that. See the screen? All right. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. And yeah, Harlan and I have done this kind of handoff a number of times now over the years, different events. And, you know, I got asked to come on here and be kind of the content presenter. And I always appreciate that because I love this topic. And Harlan brings up a good, I guess, way to phrase kind of how I approach a lot of things. And I know a lot of people here have probably seen me in something in some shape or form before. But if you haven't, right, that's okay too. You'll see me here today. But I do try to, you know, I'm an attorney by trade, MBA, CFP professional, a bunch of education. And, you know, when I heard the Harlan, you know, kind of say you question things, and I think that's one of the types of lawyers that's out there is one that was trained to question things, right? We're trained to argue the opposite side, right? That you can switch halfway through. And, you know, that's actually like a technique that you know, some law schools, not all will do, but we did that in trial advocacy, where in the middle of the practice, you would switch and argue the other side. And I think that's a somewhat helpful skill set to have in the financial planning world. The longer I've spent in this industry, I'd say the more skeptical I've become of, you know, kind of just accepting something because I thought it was true. You know, Ron Carson, who I work with now, I mean, he talks about that a lot, like challenge what you think you know, right? And can you actually truly defend it? And often I find out, you know, maybe we can't defend it as well as we thought we could. And home equity has just been one of those areas where I've just gotten an opportunity to talk about more. Honestly, there's fewer people that go around talking about it, right? So like sometimes people are like, well, why do you talk about home equity so much? And I'm like, well, because there's like 8 of us that go around talking about it. So like there's a limited group, right? Now, if I want to go talk about ETFs and mutual funds, you've got thousands and thousands of people that want to do that, and much more qualified people than me. So you get me here, right? The law of numbers are in my favor here. I'm also an attorney, right? I've worked and helped with compliance departments. I've helped draft language for compliance departments and policies here. I've helped change positions of companies to change the way they approach home equity here. So I do have experience in here from the ground up, from working with advisors, from sitting across, you know, individuals as clients, as I used to have my own clients, and all the way up to the corporate level. And so I'm going to kind of talk about the way that I view home equity, the way as an attorney, I'm starting to view some of the risk associated, and then actually how to work with compliance departments and clients. And that'll be the back half of this. So you'll see a little bit of a mix of things. We already did the bio. Only thing I'll throw out here is if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm trying to get better at this. You know, in telling people to follow me somewhere. I don't really sell a whole bunch of stuff, so I promote 1 or 2 things. So follow me on Twitter at Retirement Risks. And then I would say the one thing that I do promote here, and we won't do a lot of this, but coaching. So I'm a believer in the value of coaching for advisors, for financial service professionals. And again, it's not a pitch for that here today, but I would say if you're interested in coaching, If you listen to this and say, you know what, I want to learn from somebody like me, my coaches are way better than I am. But if you want to learn something, really easy way, I'll show this again later, but you can text 44222 Carson Coaching. We don't teach you financial planning. We teach you how to run a business. Been around since 1993. That's it. Moving on right from that. So I'm going to go through some research that I rolled out this year, maybe 3 months ago. I love this research. I've got to get better at honing into some of the really impressive pieces of it. It's, I've published about 30 different peer-reviewed pieces of research in my, publishing career. I would probably say this is, to me, the most valuable one I've come up with so far. And, that's a good thing, right? You continuously get better. We're going to dive into the fiduciary aspect. And some of the way I view that, you could say best interest at this point and replace fiduciary, but best interest fiduciary, putting clients first. That's really the only thing that matters there. Misconceptions, how to work with compliance and talk with clients. So first part here is just value of advisor. So let's just take the step back and say, why are we in this profession? Why are we out here trying to help people? Because if we can't answer that question, right, that's fundamental to everything. And so we have to start there. Now, interestingly, right, what are we here to do? We're typically here to help somebody achieve their goals. I was talking to a caddy not that long ago, and I said, what does a caddy really do? And he says, yeah, I help golfers achieve their dreams. Right. And I was like, that's actually a really good explanation of carrying clubs around. Right. But to some degree, that's what in the service profession, financial services we're doing, right? We're trying to help somebody else achieve financial security. We're helping them achieve their goals, not our goals. So what we look out today, especially in 2020, right? People are concerned. They look stressed. They're feeling it. And I can tell people are feeling it more and more as this year wears on, right? It's a tough year. It's different. Change is challenging. We saw crazy volatility for the first half of the year all the way into this last month. Last couple of weeks been a little bit better, right? Economy is just different than it's been before, right? We've got health concerns, longevity still, a conversation that's out there, running out of money. These things put stress on people. So then where do we come in, and what's the value of an advisor? So right off the top, the research that I did, we surveyed about 1,400 people, individual clients, and then tested, right, do you have an advisor, not an advisor? These are all around retirement age. And what we found, right, is just the existence of an advisor. Right? Not even a good advisor, right? It was just you had an advisor. Did you feel more confident and prepared for retirement? And what happened, right? Literally just the factor of testing, do you have an advisor, right? The people who felt highly confident about their retirement preparedness went from 47% to 59%. That's a huge jump, right? Huge jump there. Now, interestingly, this group all kind of has money. We're looking at people with $100,000 of investable assets plus. So one of the reasons is below that, we really don't get advice to. So kind of looking at, do you have an advisor or not, is, kind of not the best use of time. That is an important group, but obviously here, just the existence of an advisor creates this feeling of comfort. So then what is the advisor actually doing, right? And they could be doing 1,000 different things, right? They could just be helping with asset allocation, insurance, putting a plan together. So one of the things we tried to dive into is then what areas we're adding perceived value back to the client. Right? So then we tried to ask the client different questions. What pieces of plans did they have? What did they understand? And you'll see some of these things up here of what they wanted, right? They wanted to be educated by their advisor. They wanted to know compensation up front. They wanted interactions with the advisor. And, interactions can be a lot of different things. Phone calls, emails, probably Zoom, which we didn't even really have on there. We did have virtual meetings, but, that was less common going back December last year. And what did we see throughout the whole thing is people with more planning felt more secure. They felt more value with their clients. And every level of planning up, right? Every time you asked a client a question and they had that level of planning, what happened to their satisfaction with the advisor? It went up. So I often hear from advisors well, I do most of that. And then I'm like, well, why would you not want your clients feeling more confident and more prepared by increasing the levels of planning that you're doing? There's a lot of research in there, but essentially long-term care, life insurance, that was a big driver. Did you have the right amount of life insurance? The client believed that, much more satisfied. Did you have a written retirement plan? Much more satisfied with their advisor, much more confident about retirement. So then and retirement income process was one of them. Did you have a retirement income analysis done? And so this is where our housing wealth is going to start coming in here, as we're focusing on the income side here today. So what is retirement income planning? This is how I describe it. You've probably heard other people describe it in different ways, but I describe it like trying to hit a moving target in the wind. The target is that individual's goals, right? Like, what do you want to do? I probably want to do very different things than Harlan wants to do some days, right? My wife wants to do different things than I want to do some days. That's very normal, but that creates our target, our personal goals. Then our plan is about getting us to that target, right? Achieving it. And the plan, as I say, has to get us through this moving target. Why is the target moving in my analogy? It's because, right, we don't know how long you're going to live. Right. And that creates all types of challenges. We have to create a secure income stream for an uncertain period of time. Incredibly challenging. Now, the other part is the wind, right? I can't go in a straight line from day one of retirement to the end of retirement because things are going to change along the way. Right. Nobody argues with me about this piece, at least. Right. Like, things are going to change. Right. 2020 absolutely qualifies as wind. Right. It pushed some people off course. If you lost your job this year and you're 63, are you going to try to go back and find another job? Right? For a lot of people, they're not. They're just going to go to retirement earlier than they planned. That is pushed, right? They're everything off course a little bit. And the more planning we can do, right, the better we'll be on this. I heard a great analogy, I think in Kipling, or a version of this, which was, you can't change, right? You're sailing. You can't change how hard or the direction that the wind blows. What you can do is change, right, where your sails are. Right? So you can either, right, let the wind blow you off course into the rocks, or change your sails and help it get to where you want to go. And so that creates the flexibility in planning. Then, right, that's what we're trying to do. We're taking the goals, the risks, we're putting it all together. So then we get to, okay, let's start doing this. Let's take our goals, our risks, and put it together to create a plan. And then I say, okay, let's start looking at the assets, the income sources that a client might have. And here's one, hopefully you probably can guess the answer, but what is the average American's largest asset, right? Heading into retirement. Ding, 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 their home, right? And this comes from the last U.S. Census data. There's also some other data points you could use, but I've used that one till we get the new U.S. Census data. I like that because it's a hard data set to argue with, but their home is vastly, right? We do kind of know it's America's largest physical asset too. But when you go and look at the 65-year-old couple, meaning actual median, right in the middle, it is right about $200,000 of equity in their home and about $100,000 of other stuff, right, of equity style assets, right? When I first saw this, right, I was building our ICP, we were building a section on home equity, we pulled this out, and I was blown away by this because one, right, I was amazed that right at the middle, right, not averaging Bill Gates with me, but right at the middle, the median, this is the average American. And I said, you know what, that makes a lot of sense to me. That reminds me of my family members, right? That my family members, my parents didn't go to college. They work in construction. They pay off their home. They don't have that much else. They rely on Social Security. They rely on Medicare. What do we know about 62% of retirees? Social Security is their number one source of retirement income. Well, right, if 68% of their value is in their home, they only have $100,000 of other assets, of course Social Security is going to be their primary source of income. So this makes sense when you start looking at everything. But then the question becomes like, well, right, even here, so you say median. Well, do I serve the median household in the country? And the answer for a lot of advisors is no, that I serve more middle class, upper net worth. Interestingly enough, if you go through this data, you get to, it's somewhere right in that, depending on how you want to read it, between the 5 to top 10% of Americans before home equity actually becomes less than half of their net worth. And actually, I do this sometimes with ultra high net worth clients that come in, and you ask them, and they'll say, yeah, well, it might not be their home, but property. they still might have a third of their wealth in real estate, right? That's not very rare, right? Go around in Dallas and, go in California, and you might have a $30 million client and they have a $15 million house, right? Well, all of a sudden that's 1/3 right there. So this tends to remain still a very important asset all the way up. Now, here's the flip side. What can you argue on the other side, right? What's America's average American's largest liability? Well, ding, ding, ding. I say their home. It's probably a little bit more complex than that, right? It's their housing costs, right? So to simplify and make the answers the same, but truly it's their housing costs. So then if you go to, and this is a little bit more recent data, you could actually pull one newer than this now too. These don't change a whole lot from year to year though, typically. 2020, probably look at different expenditures. My guess is this has gone up a lot as average expense this year. We're actually not spending on a lot of other things. So if you look at home costs, probably in 2020, it's an even more significant portion. But for the average American, right at the median, right again, it's about 1/4, 22% of all of their costs. It's more than taxes. It's more than healthcare. This actually continues into retirement. If you look at retirement years, home costs now have become the number one cost for housing costs for retirees too. It's the number one cost. So it's our largest assets. It's our top cost. Well, again, those two things actually make sense, right? Because if we are paying towards our mortgage and our housing, right, as our top expenditure, and we're creating equity as we pay down our debt, it makes the reason that that's also going to be one of my largest assets, right, as I free up that debt. So these things actually do, if you kind of take a step back, well, at first they feel a little contradictory. They actually do make sense on why these two things are occurring at the same time. But what that leaves us open to is, one, we have a valuable asset, but at the same time, we also have a cash flow issue. And so both of those things need to be considered as part of our planning. Now, the next part here is what I say fiduciary mindset. And that's important. I went back to the beginning and I've got that intro bullet, which I should probably change at some point, but where it just says fiduciary, but it's really about fiduciary mindset. And I came up with this maybe when the DOL rule had passed a couple of years ago. And I kind of had this notion that, you can also just choose to be a fiduciary, right? Like, we can force it on you, or you can have the mindset that I'm always going to put clients' interests first. I'm going to try to mitigate risks. I'm going to be open. I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to act in their best interest. And the reality is that is a fiduciary mindset. So it doesn't matter about the legal standard so much in my conversation. It matters about the mindset that you take to put clients first, right? To do planning, to get them feeling more confident about retirement, going back to the why. Why are we here? We're here to help the client. And if you keep that in the front of your mind, you will act like a fiduciary, whether you're legally obligated to do that or not. But let's just say, right, you are legally obligated to be a fiduciary, right? That you do have a legal obligation here. You're a CFP, you're an RIA, which has the legal obligation for portions of things, right? You're working with ERISA assets. All of these things could bring you into a legal fiduciary standard. Now, here I walk through basically, what should you consider? Right? This is something I thought through this process before is, if I was going to litigate against somebody. So I'm an attorney, and I'll pick on Harlan because I can still see him on the video, and I didn't pull up the list of all the other participants, which is usually a good thing to do. So I pick on other people, but Harlan's good enough one as any. He's seen this before anyway, right? And if Harlan was my advisor, and I went to Harlan, I said, "Are you a fiduciary, Harlan?" He nods his head. If you want to, you can hop in for this part too if you want, Harlan. So we can go back and forth a little bit, right?
Sounds good. Yes.
And if I'm the attorney, I come in and we're suing Harlan because my client feels like they were harmed because Harlan didn't do his job as a fiduciary advisor. And I say, Harlan, right? Was it prudent for you to look at all of my client's stocks when you were doing planning, right? Would you look at stocks?
Absolutely. I would have looked at all of them, even if I didn't manage them.
Yeah, of course you would, right? Like, even if you weren't managing them, it should impact like the risk tolerance. And that's on here too. You looked at risk tolerance, I hope too, Harlan, right? Like, you understood where our client was from a risk perspective.
I had him fill out a little sheet and it was like 4.3. And yep, I did all that.
Yeah. Some random number. I have no idea if that math is any good, but you did it. The COA, right? You covered yourself, right? You looked at their tax rate too, right?
We think taxes are very important. We took a look at all of that when we looked at them taking money out of their investments.
Yeah, it seems like a prudent thing to do. Well, you looked at their bonds and their safe assets to cash, right? You looked at what they had there, right?
Yeah, they usually wanted to keep about 10, 15, 20% in cash and bonds. We did that.
Yeah. Did you look at any insurance needs or cash flow, liquidity, any of those things?
Oh, I've heard of
Right.
people getting burned on the long-term care. We looked at their long-term care, their life insurance. We even went into their P&C insurance and, their liability, all of that.
Yeah. And then you get to this last one. You say you looked at their home equity too, right? You discussed how much home equity they have, what's the best ways to use that and leverage it over time. And you did that.
Well, no, I really left that up to the mortgage guy because that's not something I manage.
Right. Yeah. It's but you're a fiduciary, right? Which means you do comprehensive planning, right? It's on your website.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, pretty comprehensive. But my client, I don't know if you saw this chart back here a second ago, Harlan, but 2/3 of her wealth is in her home, and she was paying a planning fee for comprehensive planning, and you chose not to look at 2/3 of her wealth.
It's debt equity, and it's nothing that I could do anything with. So I just left it there, and I told her one time, I guess maybe she should downsize, but she didn't want to move. But yeah, I didn't really talk much about that.
Yeah. And sometimes you get that, right? You might get, right. May I said downsize once. We said refinance once. And 2/3 of the client's assets, you spent 10 minutes in one meeting over the course of 10 years with the client, right? So when you think about 2/3 of their wealth, you spent what percentage of your time talking about 2/3 of their wealth? Less than 5%, less than 2%, less than 1%, somewhere in there.
I wish you weren't an attorney.
Yeah, that's it. Right. And I'm not saying something would go exactly like that, but you can see in front of a jury, right? All of a sudden you're sitting here and you're trying to defend. You saw that chart that is up, and I've got a client with $3 million house and $200,000 of assets. They ran out of assets and you didn't do anything with the home. And, all of a sudden, this attorney's pressing you on that in front of a group. All of a sudden you could see, you know what, that's not a great place to be in, right? Like I wouldn't necessarily want to have to defend that, right? Because a lot of people that would be sitting there would be shaking their heads saying, well, yeah, a lot of my wealth is in my home. And yeah, maybe we should have looked at some of these things. And I'm not saying that there's a particular solution you would have needed to bring up. Right now, one of the reasons I have this list here is because I actually went a couple years ago through FINRA rulings and found that somebody has been dinged on every single one of these ones before for failure to discuss and consider when making a recommendation. Right now, some of them are so obvious you would say, of course, right? Like if I didn't talk about my client's stocks, bonds, tax rate before I made a recommendation, right? Even outside of a fiduciary landscape, right? An insurance sale by ignoring them would fail the suitability rules, right? And actually, probably you could say risk tolerance, insurance needs, liquidity. You might even fail suitability based off of all those too. So it does kind of stand to reason that this is a reasonable or prudent factor to consider when making recommendations, especially under a fiduciary standard. Now, if that one is, as I said, I haven't really found a bunch of FINRA cases or anything around failure to recommend a reverse mortgage and failure to talk about home equity. Now, there have been cases about failure to consider cash flow needs and housing being part of that, right? So that has come up. So the next part here, as I said, I haven't really seen this at FINRA yet. As I said, there are some cases about refinancing, not considering liquidity, debt management. So those are pretty close, right? They're not far off here. Now, this was a really interesting case. Some of you have seen this before if you've seen me present. There was a part of a case, I should say, that was filed against Lincoln. And this was really interesting. Now, this has not set a whole lot of kind of precedents and issues out there, but it was very interesting. And I think the attorney here did a really good job. And so what the attorney did is there was a suit that said, hey, I have a life insurance policy. And essentially the policy was blowing up and getting really expensive and the person couldn't meet the premiums. And so they went into Lincoln, their agent, and said, hey, we're having a problem with this. And the agent basically said, well, you can keep making the premiums, or you can do what? You can surrender it for the cash value. Eventually, they sue. And what they sue under is actually this idea that they were not informed that there was a secondary market by their agent. This is not a fiduciary level, but it was the failure to inform them that there could be a life settlement option that was better. Now, Lincoln, and probably up to this point, said, you know what? Yeah, this is, fairly straightforward, right? Like, we don't have a duty to inform you of other options out there. We weren't providing ongoing advice at this point. We're not under a fiduciary model, and failure to tell you about all of your options is not really something that falls in here. And even if you find all of those things, the policy was still a good policy. You're not even saying the policy was a bad policy. So we never harmed you here. There are no damages. And this is the part that got really interesting, which was, right, the court said, you know what? There's enough here to proceed on damages because the continued payments of premiums, even for a good policy, could qualify as damages. And where I then thought about this, that you could take this from, was if somebody had a mortgage and you failed to talk about refinancing, you failed to talk about downsizing, you failed to talk about a reverse mortgage, and and I'm not saying any one of those would be needed, but you failed to address the problem. There was a cash flow issue. They were making payments, even though it's not saying that the house or the mortgage payments were bad, but you failed to address it. Could that reach the level of damages for continued payment of your mortgage premiums instead of doing something else? Well, a court has said continued payment of other premiums qualifies as potential for damage. Now, this gets settled. You don't get an answer on this, but it is at least an interesting argument from a legal perspective. Well, there is a really good question in here. I think Harlan, you chimed in a little bit on this, but we'll get to it in a second. So the housing elephant, right? This is the real question that I think from a legal perspective, I think that I've, as I said, I've worked a lot on this, right? Can you provide prudent retirement income distribution advice, right? Retirement advice without considering home equity? And if you lay this in line with everything else, I think the answer is very hard to say yes here. Right? I think it is very hard. Now, that is not saying in any case you have to come up with the same solution, answers, products, right? I always want to be clear on that. A lot of people take this as saying, by law, you're trying to tell me that I have to do X and recommend X. No, that's not true anywhere, right? What you do is you take in information, data, what a prudent person would, familiar with that situation, right? That's relevant to it, and consider that in the formation of your recommendations. So that is really what's required, in my view, from a legal perspective. And this whole world is going to continue to get more litigious around enforcing this, right? We're not moving away from enforcing fiduciary rules, right? We're moving more and more towards it here, right? We're not going to see less lawsuits. We're going to see more lawsuits. And, that, right, that's just, that's the trend. It's not a short-term trend. It's a 30-year trend, and it's still continuing. Now, obviously, you could switch that trend somehow, but right now that is the trend. That's the way that we're going. So then it's walk through the solutions, walk through the factors you want to consider, right? Do you want to downsize? You want to help sell a home and move to a CCRC? I just heard that one today on a call. Continued care retirement community. Do you want to sell your home and live with family? Certain, right? There's actually a lot of benefit to that, actually. That's very normal in certain cultures, right? My grandparents lived with us when I was a kid, right? Like, that was more normal. It's become less normal today, but there are a lot of benefits to that. Sale leaseback, agent-based solutions, right? Home sharing, which I usually say is like Golden Girls. Special purpose loans are more like locality-based loans, typically to help lower income with tax payments, long-term care, things like that. Home equity lines of credit, refinancing, right? Just re-leveraging your home. You could also think paying down a mortgage faster could fall into there too. Reverse mortgages, obviously a part of this conversation too. Harlan, probably like this on Monday, I probably one of the more recently, I just had an advisor reach out to me and said, hey, the Heckham for purchase. Can you tell me more about it? Right. Just out of the blue. And so you're hearing more and more like this. So this is also a good one here. So we'll get to some of these questions in there. So Gary and Mark, will address both of those. Luckily, Harlan does have a lot on that. Kind of skipped forward here. So let's talk about some of the challenges, some of the things out there. So misconceptions, what do we see? So there is this
Jamie,
big,
before you jump into that, and to kind of put an exclamation point on your other scenario, when my dad retired, there was less than 10% of people that had mortgages. Now it's about 44% that have mortgages at 62. So this is going to be a bigger issue. Millions of people just refinanced at 62, 65 for the next 30 years. So they're not running out of that anytime soon.
Yeah, and so this one's here. Mark Richards asked a really good question. So I'm just going to hop over here and talk about that one before we move on. So it's like, how often do you encounter people with $1 million home and no savings, investments, or insurance? So that really depends on where they are in their life cycle, right? It is not all that uncommon to see somebody in their 80s run out of investments and have no real insurance left and be left with $1 million home, right? That is actually not all that strange. Seeing a lot of people with $1 million homes, no investments, no savings going into retirement, I wouldn't say is all that common, but do you see it? Are there thousands of Americans that are going into that every year? Absolutely. I think probably the most common one that I see that where the home really you see more often, and this is a scenario I see all the time, which is somebody with the $500,000, $600,000 home and $100,000 or $200,000 in IRA and 401k savings. They had 3 kids. They put all 3 kids through college. They paid, $500,000, $600,000 to get all these kids through college. They used some of that money. They had an event at some point. They pulled some money out of their IRAs and used it. And they get to retirement like $200,000 in their IRA and a $600,000 home. That's a very common scenario that you run out into. I'm sure everyone here works with clients that they can immediately identify in their head and say, you know what, I do have a lot of those clients, right, that have that. My mom's going to be like that. She's almost paid off her, mortgage, probably living in a $500,000 home, probably doesn't have more than $80,000 in savings, right? Because she's run her own business, didn't go to college, right? Put her kids through college, going to be mostly relying on Social Security, and has a house that's gone up in value, probably more than average out there. So, Martha said, go to California, right? There's people with $8 million homes in California with absolutely no savings. So it absolutely does happen. So that is a good one. So getting back here, we'll hit some of these other ones here later. Gray divorce is a great question. I will get to that one too. So misconceptions. We've got some big ones out there, and I've published in Journal of Financial Planning on this before. Reputational risk, protecting the homeowner, compliance concerns. To some degree, the marketing, I don't have that on here, but I do typically like to address that because people tend to ask me how I feel about having celebrities promote products, right? Everyone's probably aware of that. The one thing I say, I'm not a huge fan of that, but the one thing I'll always push back if I take the opposite side is like Citibank, right? Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Probably most financial companies that are large have used celebrities to push something at some point. I mean, ads on TVs tends to use celebrities, right? What is it? Jennifer Garner, I think, for Citi. And she's been doing those commercials for lines of credit and credit cards for a long time. So it is not that odd to actually see celebrities promoting financial instruments on TV either. Some of the fund companies have used celebrity spokesmen too. So I'm not a huge fan of it. But on the flip side, I would say, I think that, maybe reverse mortgages get too hard of a kind of a gripe on that, being that a lot of financial companies do the same thing, but you can disagree with all of it, but it's not necessarily totally out of line with other marketing standards, to be honest. So again, I'm not a huge fan, but it is what it is. The educating advisors, University of Illinois, Dr. Craig Lemoyne just put out some interesting stuff on that. So this was one of the things that I was asked to make sure I hit, which was compliance. So when I've worked with compliance departments on this before, one of the first things that you realize is the image problem. And it's absolutely true. And it's probably true when I see comments typically in, like even chat boxes, you can kind of tell. And if I asked you to rate a reverse mortgage, I could probably tell based off your comments in there pretty quickly. But there is an image problem here. We see bad press. Bad press around this is really easy. You see the news story that says so-and-so is getting kicked out of their house and they had a reverse mortgage. And there's always this implication that the person was removed from their house because they had a reverse mortgage. And Harlan knows this. A lot of people who dive into this realize that it is almost never, not never, but almost never that's the cause. What is typically the cause? That they haven't made tax payments and they've completely run out of funds across the board. This happens regardless if you have a reverse mortgage. If you don't pay your taxes and you run out of money, you often don't get to keep your property, right? That is not related, right, necessarily to reverses. But there was this notion of telling people to take a lot of equity out of their home, compensating loan officers for that. And these were people who were slowly running out of money as it is. So if they lived long enough, they ran into problems. Now, some of the regulatory changes that have occurred over time have created set-asides with the reverse so that property taxes can still be paid. So even that situation, we have created regulatory restraints there to help stop that, because nobody wants people thrown out of their house. It's actually not good for the government either, because then they end up on some other type of system. Not well understood, bad media, cross-selling. Cross-selling's probably been the biggest concern from the compliance world. It's what they worry about. It's that they worry that I'm going to recommend, take a mortgage, take a reverse mortgage, leverage, take on debt, pull equity out, essentially by leveraging it with debt, and then buy another product that I get compensated on. Right? That is the number one real risk on that side, because that's a true conflict, right? Where I am essentially giving a recommendation to increase my own income as the advisor. So conflicts are things to be concerned about. So a lot of compliance departments, going back about a decade or 12 years ago, did put in rules about limiting those conflicts. Some just went, you know what? This isn't a big revenue item for us, so let's just ban it. Let's just not allow it. And I don't have a good way to monitor the people on our network. Places like LPL, for instance, right, went really far on that. It's very hard to monitor independence, right? So that was a challenge. So they went very far, and they're not alone. A lot of companies went really far and banned it. Now, those are being walked back recently, and most of it's around we're moving to this planning notion. And if we can't talk about things and educate, we're creating a different kind of risk on our plate. Now, when working with compliance, if you want to talk about reverse mortgages, if you want to educate clients and compliance gives you a hard time, this is always one. It's really important. Be very respectful of compliance. If you start off adversarially with compliance, guess what you're going to get back from compliance? You're going to get back an adversarial attitude. A lot of compliance people are attorneys. So if you start being an adversary with them, they were trained to be in an adversarial role. So you won't get good help. Compliance departments have told me this over and over again, right? Like, we get really angry people. They come in, they start yelling at us and sending us nasty emails. Well, ask, right? Ask for help. Start with that. I know that seems simple, but a lot of times we're fired up. We're angry when compliance says we can't do something that we know is right. And start with that, using the client's language, using the best interest of the client. That is beneficial. Ask for guidance on their written policies. And I'll have this again here in a second. Compliance gets this wrong. I've had it happen over and over again where compliance departments just send me an email and say, hey, we're not allowed to talk about this. And I say, oh, that's interesting. I'd love to see the written policy statement. They send me the policy statement, and the policy actually says something completely different. It typically says like, oh, you can't get compensated for the recommendation of a reverse mortgage. And I'm like, okay. Well, that makes sense. They shouldn't be getting compensated on it. I don't think anyone has a problem with that. So, and then the idea of education versus recommendations. It is less likely that any compliance department limits your ability to educate on an item. Now, you might not be able to recommend a particular item, and that's a little bit different. But the education to clients, very different. So the ability to educate and allow clients to make their own informed decisions, right? Educate, right? Inform, empower. That is very hard for compliance departments to sound off against. So again, right, ask for written policies, understand what they say, and when they get things wrong, right, remember to ask questions and be polite. That's the best way to move these things forward. Now, one of the other ones we get all the time is advisors telling me I can't do this because FINRA says I can't, right? How many people have said that to somebody? And Harlan, I know you've heard that before. FINRA says I'm not allowed to talk about reverse mortgages, and it's almost the opposite of what the FINRA investor alert says going back to 2012. it actually says in there, right? Now, again, FINRA's language is actually towards consumers and what they should do. It actually has nothing to do with what advisors should do on this side. But what they tell consumers is that they should get advice from a trusted advisor when it comes to a reverse mortgage. So my standpoint on all this is, if you can't give them advice on a reverse mortgage, guess who you are not, right? FINRA says,
advisor.
yeah, that's how it logically goes, right? If FINRA says, hey, client, go to your trusted advisor to get advice on this. I go to you, you can't give me advice. Guess who you're not? You're not my trusted advisor because you can't help me with the things that you should be able to help me with. And we see things in here like, hey, it's complicated. I don't know all this stuff. Those are the exact areas that advisors should be helping clients with. It shouldn't be the easy stuff that we're helping them with. They should be offboarding, right? The difficult things, right? I can fill my car with gas. I shouldn't pay anyone to fill my car with gas. If the engine breaks, it's more complex. That's where I should outsource and pay somebody to do that because it's more complex and I don't have the skill set. It's the complex areas of planning where you really add value. So talking to clients, again, it's simple. Lead with planning, right? This is just a part of planning and it's about education, right? And it's not about jumping into the deep end first. And we've had this problem where somebody hears a reverse mortgage or here's a product presentation and they run out immediately. And the next meeting they're in, they recommend a reverse mortgage. They recommend the life insurance product. They recommend the 3x leverage Tesla buy. And what happens? You jumped right into the deep end without learning how to swim first. You didn't test the water. You didn't know if the client wants to go there. So we have to walk our way into this, which means learning, right, about the benefits of reverse mortgage. What are the client's perceptions of it? And the average client is going to view this as a negative tool. It has a perception issue, right? At a Likert scale of 1 to 7, the average person rates it on a 3 as a positive tool. So it's viewed as a slightly negative tool, not as positive. So if you jump right in this with all your clients, you're going to create, right, pushback. So you have to understand the questions to ask. Clients don't understand reverse mortgages, right? We did a survey, again, published in Journal of Financial Planning, 10 questions, true, false, and the average American scored a 4.8 out of 10. Right? That was the average, right? That's worse than flipping a coin, as I always say, that monkeys would have performed better. Why? Because we have very deep-seated misconceptions about this, that most people think when you engage in reverse mortgage, you give up title to the house. It's one of the biggest misconceptions out there, which by law, you cannot do. You have to maintain title of the house to enter into a reverse mortgage. Education important, right? I just have a couple of things here to skip through. Factors to consider in planning. This is a good and helpful list. And then I think it's a good time to answer some of these questions as we're about 47 minutes. And that's about as much time as you should probably listen to me. And I know there was a question before about kind of columns, data analysis, and we'll touch on that here too. So factors consider, right? Just walk through some of these. You don't have to use all of them, right? What percentage of a client's wealth is in their home? Some client experience and dashboards will pull that in for you. Do they have liquidity issues, right? What part of their income is dedicated to housing costs? I'm actually amazed not very many advisors can quickly answer that for a lot of clients. But that seems like an important one to me. Do they carry a large mortgage? What's their mortgage interest rates? Now, some people, we've seen a lot of refinancing, but probably still for the rest of the year, we're going to see a decent amount of that and into next year. What are other costs associated with their home? Does their home fit their lifestyle needs? What's their current rate, right? Do they, what's their withdrawal rate from other assets? That's a really good one. We start thinking more comprehensively. Do they plan on living in the house for the rest of their life? And a lot of retirees, they want to age in place. So then you can start asking questions to understand about this, right? Like, do you feel your home meets your needs? Do you want to live there throughout retirement? Do you want to relocate? What do you want to do in retirement, right? Do you want to reduce home costs? And if the answer is yes, all of a sudden we've got conversations. We can add value. Do you see home equity serving as an income source? And the client says no there, right? That's driving you down your route to figure out what's the right recommendation. Do you want to rent? Do you want to sell your house? Do you want to leave it as a legacy to your heirs, right? All of these things factor into our planning around it, right? Does your home going to be part of your long-term care planning solution? For a lot of people, right, they sell their home and move into a long-term care facility. So if that's what you're doing, you're essentially bucketing your home value for the long-term care cost, and that's how you're funding it. That is a recommendation. It is a strategy, but it's important to know how we're going to use it. And I had an advisor said all they do this is they ask them how they feel about their current home. They just leave it open and let them talk about it. I was like, that's a really good one, right? Let them tell you. You don't even have to get too specific. But all of this, right, you're pulling in data and thinking and then figuring out, right, what's the right recommendation. And that's all we're talking about here, right, is pulling in the data and prudent information to make, right, decisions and recommendations to build that plan that's in the best interest of the client. So I said I had a couple more bullets, but that's probably good. Harlan, I think there was maybe 3 or so really good questions. One of these, so Gary Wolf said, hey, I'd like more illustrations showing the numbers. Did you bring some of that today? Are you going to do any of that?
I'm going to do that on our Friday call, and we're going to go into a lot of depth in that, going through the specifically buying a house with a reverse mortgage when they're downsizing, upsizing. Paying off an existing mortgage is probably the biggest scenario, but the rule of thumb is you need about 50% equity. So if I've got a $400,000 home, I owe $200,000 or less, a reverse mortgage pays off and eliminates that payment, which is one of the single biggest uses, because that is, that's several of Jamie's questions specifically related to, that is the biggest cash flow. And we see it all the time. People have 20, sometimes 15% debt ratio. And when they retire, their debt ratio goes to 30, 40% because their income goes down and they don't eliminate their mortgage. They were used to making that payment when they both were working. And now all of a sudden it's changed. And 3 million people lost their job in the last 6 months that are over 65. So that is a very significant issue.
And I would say for Gary, probably the best resource out there on the illustration stuff is also going to be Wade's book. It's fantastic on that. And I think Harlan's probably got one behind him. So if you do want to reach out to him, they'll send those out, right? You still sending Wade's book too?
We do. We buy them by the buckets.
Yeah. That's a fantastic one. Somebody asked about gray divorce in there too. So gray divorce is just more of our senior divorce. And I see, Harlan, you wrote back on that too, where we're actually seeing, it's actually the only area where divorce is actually increasing in the country. It's interestingly enough, actually millennials are getting divorced at a lower rate, even at the age and number of years they've been married, than the past 2 generations. So for as much as we hear about, hey, millennials and they're all getting divorced, it's actually not true. It's again, one of those things we think is true, but is inaccurate. But we are seeing increases, right, in gray divorce. Some of that is, society's become more okay with it, a little bit more independence, more equitable distribution of property rights over time. But reverse mortgage, we do work with divorce attorneys that use reverse mortgages now to split up value, because one person in retirement wants to stay in the home. So you can actually use a reverse to split up half of the value and essentially distribute that out while maintaining the home for the other person, as opposed to both of them leaving the home, selling it to split up the value. Not always the right thing, but it is a tool during those gray divorces as a way to protect the home for one of the 2 individuals. So it is, we do see that come up. Accounting dust, Steve asked. Yeah, I blew through that one. Accounting dust is, I've heard that from some firms on, well, why would we even add reverse mortgages and allow our advisors to talk about them? That's accounting dust, meaning that it's not a significant portion of the income. It's not going to be a significant portion of the advisor's income, the company's income, right? So when you start looking at the corporate level, they start looking at things on value. How do we make our money? We don't make money on reverse, so why add on the risk? And that's where that accounting dust term came from. But as we move away from this product world and we move towards a planning world, right, that notion kind of goes away. We have lots of stuff now that we provide recommendations on in a planning world that we make no true money off of, right? So I think that accounting dust is going away, but that set up this mindset of, well, let's just ignore this. Let's not talk in the mortgage and housing world because we don't make money on that. And that's kind of a good thing. So
to chime in on that specifically, you mentioned that a lot of people want to leave their house to their kids as a legacy. We're talking to the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors. If people invest in insurance for a legacy, my kids much prefer the life insurance policy than they do my house because they're not going to live in my house. And when I'm 90 and they're 60, I hope they have their own house. They do now, so I hope they still have it. So the whole idea of legacy, when we do that planning together, there is sometimes a better place to store that money than into an illiquid asset called home equity. And so that's where we work together in planning. It may seem like accounting dust, but if that money is redirected, it's going to go to something that is much more powerful, much more valuable, even if you can afford to make a mortgage payment. Just because you can afford to make a mortgage payment doesn't mean you should get one. Jamie can probably afford a Maserati, but I bet you he doesn't have one. So just because you can afford one doesn't mean you should get it. Just because you can afford to make a payment doesn't mean you should do it. There's better places to put the money.
Harlan, I have 3 kids, 3 and under. I cannot be affording a Maserati. I have 3 car seats. I don't think Maseratis fit them.
That might be a problem, yes. And up here in Wisconsin, we don't have snow tires on Maserati, so it wouldn't do me any good either. By the way, there's been several questions about the books. We have 600 offices, several hundred loan officers. Just let us know, reverse events at fairwaymc.com. I'll bring my screen up for that information. If you can drop your screen, Jamie, and you can just send us an email and we'll make sure that we deliver that to you and that you're going to get that. So that is something that we'll make sure that education is so important, and we will be happy to share that with you. Just let us know. And this is the info right here that you can email us at, either myself personally or reverse events. Because it is so important that education is out there and that we can help you together with that. Let's see, there's a couple of other questions to make sure that we get that out to you. Let me see here. There was one that I know that they asked about before that I saw when I was going to wait for you on this, Jamie. When he was talking, when Matthew had asked the question, are we really saying that a fiduciary is responsible for all of a client's life choices? No, there's a lot of things that you're not going to advise on, such as medical. Yeah. But realize that this is what Jamie's saying. This is a big this is a big financial deal. Go ahead on that one, Jamie.
Yeah. So Matt, that's actually a great question. So no, by no means am I saying that a fiduciary is responsible for all of life choices or even all of a client's financial planning decisions. You can actually, right, like the CFP standard, for instance, says you can limit the scope of your engagement to cover certain things, right? Like, so you can actually engage somebody in a conversation only about long-term care planning and only focus on, right, the information that would be prudent to consider in that recommendation. So you do not have to engage in holistic planning. Now, what I would say is a lot of advisors go out there saying, we do comprehensive planning. You have now, right, held yourself out to looking at comprehensive financial planning, which 100% includes home equity, includes reverse mortgages, includes refinancing. That is all part under comprehensive planning. Now, there are certain things that, Harlan said would fall out, but you can always limit your scope of engagement. That's, become more clear, I think from the CFP standards over the last year that you should actively do that and limit the scope of your engagement. Attorneys do that all the time. Attorneys tend to be specialists. You go to an attorney and they say, here's the scope that we're going to engage with you on. I am not going to cover all of your legal aspects, and they're fiduciaries. So as a fiduciary, you can absolutely limit your scope, but if you represent that out, but I think if you say I'm doing retirement income planning and you ignore cash flow from home equity, their asset, and right, the kind of liability that's associated with that, clearly that's part of it. So you are at that point missing things as part of that analysis. But again, you wouldn't even have to do retirement income planning. So that's probably a better explanation of that, but that is a really good question. So by no means are fiduciaries required to look at everything. You can absolutely limit the scope of your engagement.
There was a question specifically on money that you could get out of a $500,000 house, and you get money one of 3 ways. We convert money either to a lump sum, which is about 50%, $250,000. Of course, you still own the other $250,000 in equity. Or you can get a growing credit line, a line of credit that's guaranteed to go up at about 3.5% for as long as you live in the house, no matter what happens to the value of the house. or you could take it out into what you would call an annuity. We don't call it an annuity, we call it a 10-year payment, but somewhere a bit less than $1,000 a month for as long as you live in the house. I worked with a lady that was in her 90s and she was still getting a check for $3,000 a month. And do remember that all proceeds that come out of a reverse mortgage are borrowed money, so they are tax-free, which is a very significant part of planning when you're comparing that to distributions from IRAs, sequence of returns risk, and all of the other factors that go together. Virtually everything we do for a planning for that client is going to affect what kind of planning you do, and vice versa. That's why we feel this partnership is so important. And
Harlan, there was a request to go back to a previous screen.
Oh yeah, that starts with lead with planning, Jamie.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure which slide they wanted from there, but I will say if you want to email me, I'm happy to send you a PDF of my slide deck. So that might be the easiest thing. And
as well too, this will be posted on our Business Performance Center at NAIFA.org. And the recording and deck will be posted, so there'll be opportunity to access it to the site.
And we will make available the books. So one of the other thing is a much more detailed commentary of what Jamie wrote. We have thousands of these reprints for you that one of our loan officers can drop off, or we can email to you the link. But specifically says the financial advisor should avoid error by omission and consider reverse mortgages. And it's interesting that an attorney would say this: despite some substantial improvements over the past 5 years, the vast majority of financial services professionals still fail to incorporate home equity planning or reverse mortgages into their practices. And yes, this is a failure. In my opinion, this is Jamie's opinion, not including home equity and reverse mortgages in the financial planning process is the largest failure of the financial services profession at this time. That's pretty hardcore. And some people have got offended with that when I've showed them that, because they said, well, that's not my responsibility. There's $7.2 trillion that people have stored in their houses. $7.2 trillion. That's kind of something significant to talk about. And we're not saying you should do it so we can sell more reverse mortgages. We're just saying, why on earth would you not make that part of your planning? I couldn't imagine doing my personal financial planning. I'm 60 years old without planning on doing a reverse mortgage in 2 years. It's just part of my planning. Whether I'm working or not, whether or not I can afford the mortgage payment, I'm always going to look at what's going on with that equity. And right now, if you can get mortgages under 3%, that gives you a guaranteed that every time you make a payment, that is, guess what, into an illiquid asset that's earning less than a 3% rate of return. Most financial planners would not tell their clients to do that. And so that's why it needs to be part of the planning.
And somebody asked if I'm related to Malcolm Gladwell. No, but I do like the tipping point. I
was just going to say, we're at a tipping point where, with where we are in the mortgage and retirement business, I feel like that's a pretty relevant question.
Well, that's my all-time favorite business book is The Tipping Point, and we believe that we are getting very close to that when it comes to the reverse mortgage financial planning scenario, because somehow some of that 7.2 trillion needs to be put over. And if you got 44% of the population making a payment at 62, the question is why? I've asked many people, what's the purpose of making a payment if you don't have to? And that's kind of stumped a lot of financial planners, a lot of people smarter than myself that just said, well, because you have to. Well, what if you don't have to? And we're certainly at a time when, unlike my father in 1981, who retired with the, if anybody remembers what interest rates were in 1981, he was getting double digits on his CDs in 1981 because I paid 16% for my mortgage in 1981. We are not in 1981. It is the exact opposite of that. And so planning needs to be different, and less than 10% of people had mortgages when they retired. That's not the case in 2020. Okay, any other questions that we've missed that you want to throw in? We're going to make sure that we get this information out to you. We appreciate very much and are thankful to you, Jamie, because how we think. I went to a seminar a few months ago, and the presenter said that the way we think is more important than anything else in our life. And I had to think about that for a while, literally think about it. And that is why what we started with this morning, or at noon when we started, I admire you so much because of the way you think and the way you push other people to think. And as advisors, that's what we get paid to do. And we certainly need to work harder. And there's also an old story that two heads are better than one. That's why Fairway has joined in partnership with NAIFA to work together to take two different areas of discipline and make sure that we are doing what's best for the client. Will that increase your business? Will that increase our business? Probably, but that's not the main goal. That comes as a side benefit, because if we lead with planning, we need to include this. And then as a side benefit, we may be compensated more, but that's not the important thing. We're going to make a difference and change the way retirement is done in this country. So thank you, Jamie, for the thoughts that you have put into this and the valuable time that you spent with us today. And either in contacting us, we'll make sure we get you Jamie's books, book, or Wade's book, or some of the other information that you need to be able to wade through some of this information. And the best way to do it by far is sit down, and before you ever talk to clients, just sit down with 3 case studies in different scenarios and run through with one of our planners as to how is this going to help my client. And because we can talk about this theory all day long, but until we actually take a look at Dave and Sue and Bill and Helen and the widow, Susan the widow, we're not going to really fully understand how this works. And thank you, Brian, for providing us the platform to be able to put this together and make a difference. David asked one more question there. Closing costs a percentage of the home's value. Some of them are, and some of them are just standard state charges like appraisals and title work and state taxes and so on. And we always give you a full disclosure of exactly the costs that are involved.
Excellent. Gentlemen, this was a pleasure. We thank you for your participation. For everyone that joined out there virtually, thank you for spending some time with us. And hopefully we can walk away, I guess, with the Gladwell theme that reverse mortgages don't have to be outliers, and they can be part of the conversation in financial planning. So we're excited to have you. Thanks again. Everyone stay healthy, stay safe. And again, this will be available on demand through NAIFA's Business Performance Center at naifa.org. So thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.